I'm going to do something here that I probably shouldn't do, and that's to talk about a couple of books which I read 20 years ago and only kind of vaguely remember, and one of them I didn't even finish at that. But kind of when I started up this project of scripted reviews, I kind of mentioned in the original video that I'm a bit of a completist, so it kind of gives me a feeling of incompleteness if I kind of leave anything out. And this is something that arguably I reviewed on the blog at one point. So I'm just going to talk about it. Fair warning though, I probably shouldn't be doing this. Probably shouldn't be doing this because I'm going to not say anything intelligent and my memory is probably faded and I might even get something wrong here. But there's a couple, the book is, I think, called well, it depends. I've heard it called the Berlin Trilogy, or the Berlin 1918 Trilogy, or the November 1918 Trilogy. It's by a guy named Alfred Doblin. I stumbled across this in the library years ago, just kind of browsing through library shelves, and there was a book called Karl and Rosa. And being kind of a history buff and a leftist history buff at that, of course, I immediately recognized the story of Rosa Luxemburg. Kind of being a big fan of historical fiction, I just kind of snatched that book up. And it wasn't the easiest thing in the world to read. Well, no, it's not a difficult read. I mean, like, you know, it's not like it's hard to understand or anything. But it can be a bit of a slog at points. But I was interested enough in the history, again, kind of being a young leftist student at that time, interested in the history of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl, what was Karl's name? Liebknecht? Sorry. In the 1918 kind of socialist revolution in Germany. And then I discovered that book actually was kind of the second book in a trilogy, sort of. The other one was A People Betrayed. So I ordered that off of Amazon. Got it delivered to me right before I left to go to Japan. So took it with me in Japan. Kind of got halfway through it and got distracted by other things. I never actually ended up finishing it. Which, yeah, probably shouldn't be reviewing it. But anyways, just to give some background on this, for whatever this review is worth, there are two books in the English translation, even though it's called the Berlin Trilogy, or the November 1918 Trilogy. I think the reason is, one of those books is actually two of them. And I think, I was just looking this up online before I did this video review, I'm getting contradictory information. I think A People Betrayed is actually two books combined into one. And Karl and Rosa is the last book. Although one website was saying the opposite. People Betrayed is one book, and then Karl and Rosa are the last two books. Now, to make this even more complicated, in the original German, Alfred Doblin was a German Jew, so these were written in German. There were 4 books, so it's a tetralogy. In English, it's a trilogy, and there's only kind of 2 volumes. Now, the first book in this series was never translated into English, and I'm not exactly sure why. I was confused about that at the time when I read these 20 years ago and tried to find stuff up online. I've still been trying to figure this out. There's not a ton of information online about these books, although the people who read them do really seem to enjoy them. So like there's a very nice review in the New York Times. It's from years ago, but you can read it online now. But it looks like part of the problem was, so all 4 of these books together tell the story of the revolution in Germany at the end of World War I. The first book takes place in Alsace-Lorraine, which is where Alfred Doblin was from originally. And this is kind of where at the end of the war, the people are kind of sick of the Kaiser, and there's this little kind of mini rebellion where they set up a republic And then this kind of leads into kind of cascading events back to Berlin. And I think some of the characters who start up in this Alsace-Lorraine kind of end up marching back to Berlin with the other soldiers. Now this Alfred Doblin, as far as I can tell from doing this research online, kind of wrote these books in France after fleeing Germany under the Nazis because he was a German Jew, so it was a good time to get out. He was also kind of a leftist. So he was writing these books about kind of German people in Alsace-Lorraine in France, and it was, when was he writing? I think it was writing in the 1950s. Still apparently a sensitive topic in France to talk about Alsace-Lorraine under German control. And so that may have been one of the reasons why it never got translated into English. I know that doesn't make any sense. Like, what does the fact that it's politically sensitive in France have to do with it not getting translated into English? I don't know. It's just something I read. Sorry, I'm talking too much. My throat's going a little bit. So maybe that was the reason, or maybe that's not the reason. But either way, you cannot find the first book in English. You have to start with A People Betrayed, which I think covers books 2 and 3. Now, it's doable. It's easy enough to do. I mean, you jump in and they make some references to events in the previous book, which you're kind of missing out on, but you can tell, you can figure out what's going on. And that's what I did when I started reading A People Betrayed. In fact, I started out on the very last book, Carl and Rosa, and I still had no trouble figuring out what was going on, even though it was obvious that they were kind of referencing events beforehand. Yeah, so from the story perspective, there's no problem jumping in where the English translation begins. If you're a completist like me, though, this will just bug the heck out of you, right? Like, I can't, I never have the complete story. It just bugged me. I think maybe that may have been one of the reasons I just didn't feel a need to kind of finish the whole thing through, is because it already bugged me that I was kind of missing out on part of it. I think, from all accounts, from everything I've been able to read online, that first book is kind of pretty interesting anyways. Be interesting to read it. I don't know. So anyways, I'll just talk about the books I kind of read or half read. It's talking about the revolution in Germany at the end of World War I. Now, if you're a history buff or, you know, a leftist, you kind of hang out in leftist circles, then of course you know this was kind of Rosa Luxemburg and the Spartacist League and kind of the great communist revolution in Germany in 1918, where the socialists almost seized power. What people don't know or tend to forget is that the Spartacists were actually kind of the radical wing of the Socialist Party. There was, at that time in Europe, the Social Democrats were kind of a political force. So you had the Bolsheviks and the Spartacists as kind of the extreme wing, the radical wing of the socialist movement. But you also had a lot of parliamentary socialists who were coming into power at this time. In fact, again, going back to my history lectures about World War I, this was kind of supposed to be one of the big failures of socialism, is you had all these socialist members of parliament or members of the Diet or kind of whatever the parliamentary body was, who were supposed to kind of champion international solidarity and vote against the war. And they all voted for the war, except again for the radicals like Rosa Luxemburg. So she and her comrades were kind of against the war. But then Eugene Debs in the United States. But then they ended up getting thrown in jail. So when there's a socialist revolution in Germany in 1918, originally it's kind of these democratic socialists. Democratic socialists is maybe the wrong word. I think everyone at that time claimed to be a democratic socialist, but like the centrist socialists, the moderate socialists who first took power and kind of bungled things and weren't able to make everybody happy, and also weren't able to control the radicals, or kind of, depending on your perspective, betrayed the radicals. So early on in this book, forget the guy's name. I'm forgetting everyone's names. That's the other thing about these books, is there's 101 names in there, because there's all these different shades of German politicians. And again, it wasn't just Rosa Luxemburg and the Spartacists. There are all these moderate socialists and all kind of different shades of the political spectrum, kind of all vying for power. And the book really kind of plunges you into the kind of the thick of it. Now, again, I'm a history buff, so I love this stuff. Like, this is meat to me. I love getting in and kind of learning all these names and these factions and stuff like that. If you don't like that, though, stay well away from these books. Boy, they are not for you. You've got a lot of different names and factions to keep track of. Can't remember any of the names now, but there's a moderate socialist guy in power, and then he kind of turns and kind of fires, turns the guns on the more radical socialists who are kind of writing journals in their office, writing their newspapers in their offices. And this culminates with the Spartacist Revolution in 1918. In the last book, Carl and Rosa. Now all this is happening concurrently with the journey of these fictional characters who, as far as I can remember, are kind of ordinary soldiers who start out in kind of Alsace and Lorraine, and then kind of march through into Berlin. So you've got the real historical characters, and you've got the fictional characters, and they don't really interact that much. Like, the fictional characters are kind of on their own track, and kind of the real historical characters are kind of on their own track as well. But they're all kind of in the story. The author uses a lot of fantastical writing. Like, even when he's writing about real events, he kind of tells it with like a magical realist type way. And he was also an ardent Catholic, and he kind of reimagines these events with an element of spiritual warfare going on. So like Satan is a character in these books, and Satan kind of has conversations with Rosa Luxemburg. Not that, sorry, I don't mean to imply that Rosa Luxemburg is a Satanist in these books. Satan is an antagonist to Rosa Luxemburg. Satan is an antagonist to a lot of these characters. So you've got, yeah, I don't know. I found that quite interesting, or quite appealing, that you've got, even though I'm an agnostic nowadays, from a narrative element, I found that quite interesting to add in this kind of metaphysical dynamic of spiritual warfare, and kind of reimagining all these things through spiritual warfare, whether you believe in it or not. But, you know, either you kind of go for these things or you don't, I guess. So be kind of forewarned ahead of time. Yeah. So the fictional characters, I think, if memory serves, they kind of start out in the army. Now this is a digression, but I think this is something that leftists are in danger of forgetting nowadays, is how pivotal a part the army has usually played in all historical revolutions. I mean, you go all the way back to the English Civil War in the Leveller movement, right? Came out of the New Model Army. You go back to the revolution in Russia in 1917, right? It was the soldiers who rebelled. Germany, 1918, right? That rebellion started with the sailors. So it's a danger, I think leftists are in danger of forgetting their history when we kind of antagonize the military classes, or when we kind of, I don't know, there's this big divide now, right? If you're in the army, you're probably not a leftist. because we've made such a clear divide between kind of people on the left and kind of the people on the right, and the people on the right are the ones more likely to join the army and serve their country in patriotism and everything like that. And I understand completely why that's happened. I mean, if after the Vietnam War especially, or whatever, if you're an anti-imperialist, you don't want to join the army and kind of go fight in these imperialist wars. But historically, the army is where the revolutions have happened. So we want to be anti-war but pro-soldier, if that makes any sense. We want to be seen as kind of an advocate for the common soldier, I think, to have any hope in future politics. That's a digression. To move back to these books. Actually, yeah, I'm not sure if there's much more I want to say about this. The narration style can be a little bit of a slog sometimes because there's a lot of metaphors. Again, maybe this was a reason why I never finished A People Betrayed. I was just looking up reviews before I turned on the video camera online, and apparently a number of people feel the same way. I do kind of regret that I never finished that, and one of these days, actually, I should really track down that book again and just read the whole trilogy again. Except it's still going to bug me that that first book was never translated into English. Anyways, I wrote kind of an email to a friend who had expressed an interest in the book, kind of giving my cautious recommendation about the book. I had it posted on the blog at one point. So these scripted book reviews, I'm going through all my old book reviews on the blog, and so this kind of counts. So I'll just kind of read what I wrote at the time. It says, I enjoyed this book. It concerns the socialist revolution in Germany at the end of World War I. Excuse me. Doblin mixes historical characters such as Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, how do you pronounce that, with his own fictional characters. The historical parts of the book are great. Doblin is vivid in his description, and he also makes fun of a lot of the historical characters, which brings a refreshing humor to the story. Of course, if you're not familiar with World War I era German politics, and let's face it, who is, then there are a lot of strange names to keep track of. I was a history nerd, so bring it on. I don't mind learning all these new historical names, but be forewarned ahead of time. Unfortunately, the fictional characters are not as intriguing as the historical characters. The fictional characters seem a bit flat and unrealistic, and Doblin's portrayal of his fictional female characters is a bit dated and sexist, and that's me putting it nicely. Doblin was a Christian anarchist, and he uses the fictional sections of the book to flesh out both themes. But he does get pretty preachy and heavy-handed, with both the Christianity parts and sometimes the anarchism parts. There were 4 books originally. The first one, for some reason, was never translated into English. So you have to jump into the middle of the story, which isn't hard to do. You can do it, but it does give the whole thing a feeling of incompleteness. The second 2 books have been translated together into one volume, A People Betrayed, and the last one is Karl and Rosa. Now, I actually, at one time, put that on an Amazon review as well. I've stopped doing this, but I used to at that time kind of repost all my book reviews from the blog to Amazon. Somebody put in a comment, actually. A comment here said, Doblin had a Jewish background, being the son of a Jewish merchant. He studied psychiatric medicine and also worked as a journalist. When the Nazis took power in Germany, Doblin fled to Paris. He was granted French citizenship in 1936. He converted to Roman Catholicism in later years. Strange that he be considered a Christian anarchist! Exclamation point. Yeah, so after I saw that, I kind of thought, oh boy, I hope I didn't get this wrong. The thing about Christian anarchists I got from the book cover, actually, you know, the flap at the back of the book. And I looked this up and refreshed my memory. That quote comes from Günter Grass, who was kind of another famous German author. And this is the actual quote. He said that Doblin was too Catholic for the progressive left, too anarchist for the Catholics, too inelegant for the third program, and too vulgar for high school instruction. So that's where I got that from. Now, anarchistic can have a couple different meanings, right? Like it can mean like an anarchist as in like a dogmatic political anarchist, right? Like somebody who adheres to the views of Bakunin and Kropotkin. Or it can mean like anarchist, like, you know, oh, he's such an anarchist, meaning like an individualist, somebody who doesn't like dogma or being controlled. I actually was on Wikipedia and I can't quite find which one it is. It could be that maybe he was never a political anarchist. And in fact, I've read reviews of Karl and Rosa, which have said that Doblin's main critique of why the revolution failed seemed to be that there was no one of the equivalent of Lenin in Germany at that time. So anarchists don't like Lenin, obviously. So that could be an indication maybe he wasn't actually an anarchist and Günter Grass was kind of exaggerating or was wrong. I don't know. I mean, he definitely was a Christian. And again, that metaphysics kind of comes through very clearly in these books. There are kind of Satan is a character. I think there are saints that actually appear in these books, kind of the element, the idea that, well, this revolution is waging, there's kind of another dimension to it where there's a spiritual warfare dimension, is definitely very prominent in these books. Anyways, it's a mixed recommendation, but I find the general idea of these books fascinating. It's difficult for me to track down books in Vietnam. You know, I can't just go on Amazon and stuff like that. But I should really track down these books and reread them at some point. The more I talk about them, the more I'm kind of talking myself into giving them another go. And if I ever do, then maybe I'll give them a better review. But for now, I'll just kind of stop here.